Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, February 24th, 2022. World leaders condemning Russia's launching of a large-scale military invasion of Ukraine. President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson announcing new sanctions against Russia. President Biden saying Russian President Vladimir Putin chose this war and now he and his country will bear the consequences. We'll hear from them and talk about the new U.S. sanctions with Associated Press Treasury Department reporter Fatima Hussein. Plus reaction from members of Congress here in the U.S. and from NATO Secretary General and the UN Secretary General. Economic fallout from the war so far, oil prices jumping above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. And stock markets dropping sharply in early trading, but then rebounding. Dow Jones Industrial Average closing up 92 points. Also today, CPAC, the annual Conservative Political Action Conference, opening in Orlando, Florida. One of the speakers, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a possible 2024 Republican presidential candidate. This from Fox News Channel. Russian forces invaded Ukraine on Thursday by land, air, and sea in the largest military attack of one state against another on the European continent since the Second World War. The wide-ranging attack on Ukraine on Thursday hit cities and bases with airstrikes or shelling as civilians piled into trains and cars to flee. Ukraine's government said Russian tanks and troops rolled across the border in a full-scale war that could rewrite the geopolitical order. President Biden at the White House reacting to the invasion and announcing new sanctions on Russia.
We've been transparent with the world. We've shared declassified evidence about Russia's plans and cyber attacks and false pretexts so that there could be no confusion or cover-up about what Putin was doing. Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response. I just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning, and we're in full and total agreement. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. This includes VTB, the second largest bank in Russia, which has $250 billion in assets. As promised, we're also adding the names to the list of Russian elites and their family members that we're sanctioning as well. As I said on Tuesday, these are people who personally gain from the Kremlin's policies, and they should share in the pain. We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead. On Tuesday, we stopped the Russian government from raising money from U.S. or European investors. Now we're going to apply the same restrictions to Russia's largest state-owned enterprises, companies with assets that exceed $1.4 trillion. Some of the most powerful impacts of our actions will come over time as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It will strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions. And we're preparing to do more.
President Biden at the White House. About those ambitions, the president says he believes Russia has much larger ambitions than Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. President Biden also saying America stands up to bullies. We stand for freedom. This is who we are. And the president ordering an additional 7,000 U.S. troops deployed to Germany to help bolster NATO's defenses. After his opening remarks, President Biden took a couple of questions from reporters. One was about why the U.S. and Europe did not include in the new sanctions announced today banning Russia from the SWIFT banking system, which NBC News describes as not a traditional bank and does not transfer funds. Rather, it acts as a secure messaging system that links more than 11,000 financial institutions in over 200 countries, alerting banks when transactions are going to occur. Also, NBC News says cutting off Russia out of the SWIFT financial system could cut Russia off from most international financial transactions, including profits from oil and gas production, which accounts for more than 40% of the country's revenue. Here's the question to the president.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be a part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks have of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take.
President Biden taking reporters' questions in the White House East Room. Another question was on the impact that Russia's war in Ukraine is having on the economy.
Markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond, and markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely as long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period.
With more on President Biden's announcement on sanctions against Russia, we're joined by Fatima Hussein, Treasury Department reporter for the Associated Press. Thank you for doing this. New sanctions announced today on banks and oligarchs in the high-tech sector. Give us some of the details, please.
Sure. So what occurred thus far today were Treasury sanctions on 4 major banks, along with several financiers of the Russian military earlier this week, as well as elites and their families, the technology sector, the country's export controls, and there was also the issuance of Treasury sanctions on 24 Belarusian individuals and entities for their assistance in the conflict as well.
One of the potential sanctions that's been floated, and it was not announced today, is cutting off Russia from something called the SWIFT system. What is that, and do we know why they didn't include it?
Sure. So the SWIFT system stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, and it essentially handles the payment requests for thousands of banks throughout the globe. Biden made clear during his speech today that the European allies of the United States weren't interested in cutting off Russia thus far. And there's a couple of reasons why Europeans, as well as the U.S., wouldn't necessarily want to take that step. The problem is that banning Russia from SWIFT might not cut it off completely from the global economy, as well as the alternatives that could exist for doing trade outside of SWIFT. So you could think of cryptocurrency or alternative payment systems that the Chinese have developed, which could also sort of create a sort of competition in this inner conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Another blowback of this is that it would affect a lot of European transactions with Russia and in a lot of international growth. So those are a couple of reasons why Biden hasn't said that the Russian removal of SWIFT is an option. However, he did say that it is an option in the future.
President Biden, coming into this, had promised swift and severe costs if Russia invaded Ukraine. From the people you've spoken with, are the sanctions announced today swift and severe?
So they're moreover what was expected than the sanctions that were issued earlier this week. Earlier this week, we saw a couple of banks sanctioned, as well as several elite members of Russian leadership and their family members. When I spoke with experts earlier this week, the impression was that those were incredibly inconsequential. But today, predicated by the invasion of Ukraine, those sanctions have yet to be seen in terms of their effects. That was something that Biden mentioned during his speech today, that it would take time to see an impact on the effect of sanctions. So it would, because everything is so heavily tied to international commerce and oil and gas and a spread to the rest of the economy, it would take some time to actually see what the effects are. And Biden pressed that during his speech today.
We're talking with Fatima Hussein from the Associated Press. Russian President Putin knew that more sanctions would be coming if he invaded, but he invaded anyway. It sort of brings up the question of he might think that he can absorb the costs of them, but he also might think that he can get around them. How difficult is the enforcement of sanctions like these?
That's a good question. One of the issues that I've spoken with experts about recently is getting around not just the SWIFT system, but also sanctions themselves, in that there's a consideration that Vladimir Putin, has baked this into his strategy of getting around sanctions by not just utilizing cryptocurrency, but also maintaining relations with other countries in a manner, for instance, with China and Iran and North Korea, in ways that could bypass a lot of the effects of the sanctions.
Fatima Hussein is Treasury Department reporter for the Associated Press. Find her stories at apnews.com. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
On Wall Street today, the markets opening down when the war was underway, but then rebounding. The Dow closing up 92, NASDAQ up 436, S&P up 63. New unemployment insurance claims in the U.S. fell last week, reports the Labor Department. Fell by 17,000 to 232,000, the fourth drop in 5 weeks for jobless claims. Some reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine from the U.S. Congress. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair, Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, putting out a statement reading, "This unprovoked attack has brought into sharp focus the need to expel the current Kremlin leadership from the international community. Today must mark a historical shift in how the world views and deals with the despot in Moscow." And Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, tweeting, "Putin is inhumane to benefit his own ego. He has no respect for agreements Russia signed to respect sovereignty of Ukraine. He's killing innocent people like Stalin did in the 1930s. I'm praying for the people of Ukraine." And this reaction from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky.
What we have in Europe now is the first shooting war since World War II. This is a serious, serious incident. I have earlier criticized the president, and I will repeat some of that. I think the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan in August was a signal to Putin and maybe to Chinese President Xi as well that America was in retreat, that America could not be depended upon, and was an invitation to the autocrats in the world that maybe this was a good time to make a move. Looking at Vladimir Putin, he said when the Cold War ended that the breakup of the old Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical mistake of the previous century. So we know how he feels about trying to reestablish empire. A combination of perception of weakness and a yearning for empire is what led to the war in Ukraine. We are where we are. The president will be addressing this issue again shortly. We're all together at this point, and we need to be together about what should be done. But I have some advice. Ratchet the sanctions all the way up. Don't hold any back. Every single available tough sanction should be employed, and should be employed now. There's no such thing as a little invasion, and of course this invasion is far beyond just the areas of eastern Ukraine you've seen described on television. Second, if the Ukrainians have the willingness to fight, and we're going to find that out starting today, we need to make sure they are fully armed and able to use every available weapon that will help inflict maximum damage on the Russian forces. So that would be my advice to the president today, regardless of how we got to where we are where we are, and I think ultimate strength is important. Second, there will be no American troops on the ground in Ukraine. No one is suggesting that, and that is not something I would advocate either.
U.S. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell speaking in his home state of Kentucky shortly before President Biden announced the new sanctions on Russia today from the White House. Also speaking about that time, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California, he chairs the Intelligence Committee, and he also called for tough new sanctions on Russia. He was on Capitol Hill in Washington.
Russia has begun an unprovoked, unjustified, and brutal campaign against Ukraine with a full-on invasion. Civilians are being killed. Ukraine is mobilizing its opposition to the Russian invasion, and we must provide Ukraine with support to defend itself. We also are going to need to, I think, dramatically escalate the sanctions that we place on Russia for this act of naked aggression by the Kremlin dictator. We need to move, I think, to sanction the largest banks in Russia. We ought to cut off Russia from the international financing system and its ability to access Western capital. We need to attack its ability to gather sophisticated technology for its weapons systems. We ought to go after more of its oligarchs. And we need to continue to strengthen our NATO defenses in the region and protect our NATO allies. This is a terrible tragedy for the people of Ukraine. I think it's the result of a Kremlin dictator terrified of the development of democracies on his border, showing the Russian people that they can enjoy a better quality of life than under the despotism of Vladimir Putin. This attack on Ukrainian democracy, I think, is a threat to democracies everywhere. And the international community is united, must stay united in the most severe sanction regime against Russia that the allies have ever put together.
Congressman Adam Schiff is a Democrat from California and chair of the Intelligence Committee, speaking with reporters in Washington, D.C. The House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, also from California, putting out a statement reading, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is reckless and evil. The United States stands with the people of Ukraine and prays for their safety and resolve. Putin's actions must be met with serious consequence. This act of war is intended to rewrite history and, more concerning, upend the balance of power in Europe, Putin must be held accountable for his actions. By the way, the House and Senate not in session this week. They are back in next week. Max Miller was a White House aide to former President Donald Trump and is now running for Congress, seeking the Republican nomination in Ohio's 13th Congressional District. Today, Miller saying that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would not have happened if his former boss were still president.
I want to help launch this conference by pointing out one thing. Trump was right about everything. Right? He was. And today, one thing he was right about, that Biden's weakness would invite Putin's aggression, should give us a serious and somber pause. As we meet to celebrate American conservatism, Ukrainians are battling for their lives and for their country. But none of this had to happen. And with President Trump, it never would have happened. It wouldn't.
Max Miller, former aide to President Trump, now Republican congressional candidate in Ohio, speaking at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, opening up today in Orlando, Florida. New York Times writes that only hours before the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, former President Donald Trump again praised the cunning of President Vladimir Putin of Russia while lashing out at the intellect of President Biden. Mr. Trump said of Mr. Putin to donors and Republican lawmakers at Mar-a-Lago, his private club, on Wednesday, "I mean, he's taking over a country for $2 worth of sanctions. I'd say that's pretty smart." It was late Wednesday night that President Putin gave the order for what he calls a special military operation in Ukraine. He gave a speech on Russian TV. Here's a portion of that through an interpreter.
The People's Republic of Donbass asked Russia for help. In this regard, under Article 51, Part 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, with the approval of the Russian State Federal Council, and in accordance with the Friendship and Mutual Assistance Treaties with the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, ratified by the Russian Parliament on February 22nd, I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. For that, we will strive to demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and will bring to justice those who committed multiple bloody crimes against civilians, including Russian citizens.
Russian President Vladimir Putin through an interpreter late Wednesday night, referring to the two areas of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region that Russia has recognized as independent states. They're the only country that has done so. Putin also warning in a speech, any country trying to interfere with Russia's military operations can expect consequences you have never seen. CNN reporting the U.S. government is on high alert for the possibility of the conflict spilling over into cyberspace, where Russia has shown an ability to cause significant disruption and damage in the past. On Tuesday, a senior FBI cyber official warning U.S. businesses and local governments they should be vigilant against potential ransomware attacks, just days after multiple U.S. agencies issued a similar warning to executives at major U.S. banks, according to people with knowledge of both meetings. That was from CNN. Well, by Thursday morning, the full-scale kinetic military assault from Russia on Ukraine was underway. Airstrikes hitting Ukrainian cities and military bases, Russian troops and tanks streaming across at least 3 borders. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky went on TV in his country, rallying his people to fight the invaders.
This morning has gone down in history, but it is a different history for us and for Russia. We have severed diplomatic relations with Russia. Ukraine is defending itself and shall not cede its freedom. Whatever they might think in Moscow, to Ukrainians, independence and the right to live on our land is the highest value. Russia has attacked our state in a cunning way, is in the way that the Nazi Germany did during the Second World War. From today, our countries are on opposing sides of world history. Russia is on the path of evil, but much depends on the Russian people. The people of Russia will have to choose which path each of them takes. anyone in Russia who has not lost their honor, they have time to come out and protest against this war.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a televised address in the first hours of the Russian military attack on his country through an interpreter. Washington Post has this. Ukrainian authorities said Thursday that Russian forces have captured the abandoned Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the scene of a 1986 meltdown that sent a radioactive cloud over parts of Europe and left no man's land of contaminated soil and other fallout, which remains dangerous. Ukrainian Foreign Ministry tweeting, in 1986, the world saw the biggest technological disaster in Chernobyl. If Russia continues the war, Chernobyl can happen again in 2022. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Makarova, gave an update this afternoon about the war. She spoke from the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C.
What we ask all of our partners and friends to do now, first, massive sanctions for what Russia did to us in 2014, did to us for the past 8 years, and does now as they waged a full-scale war against Ukraine. Second, all the help our friends and allies can provide us with regard to the defensive capabilities. Our military and every Ukrainian is ready to defend our country. We need help in order to be able to defend our country. And third, humanitarian assistance, because the damages that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine right now are large, and of course, the day-to-day life of ordinary people is at risk and is disrupted greatly. Now, I would want to finish my statement on saying that just before I came here, we got information from our Chief Commander that one of the platoons of the 74th Motorized Brigade from Kemerovska Oblast surrendered, also noting that they didn't know that they were brought to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians, that they thought they were doing something else there. Again, Ukraine is defending our home. We will defend our home, and it's time for all free and democratic nations who value the principles and the territorial integrity and the right of any country for peace to stand together with us, but not only stand together with us, act together with us to stop the war in Europe.
The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Makarova, at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. More on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including remarks from Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, when Washington Today continues in a moment.
Listen to C-SPAN Radio with our free mobile app, C-SPAN Now. Get complete access to what's happening in Washington, wherever you are, with live streams of floor proceedings and hearings from the U.S. Congress, White House events, the courts, campaigns, and more, plus analysis of the world of politics with our informative podcasts. C-SPAN Now is available at the Apple Store and Google Play. Download it for free today. C-SPAN Now, your front row seat to Washington, anytime, anywhere.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. President Biden announcing earlier today sanctions against Russia, and he said that he had just finished up a virtual meeting of the leaders of the G7 countries, the top wealthiest liberal democracies, which are agreeing to coordinate their sanctions and their response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Guardian newspaper in Great Britain writes that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said it is time to squeeze Russia from the global economy piece by piece, as he announced a wide-ranging sanctions package against Moscow, including freezing the assets of all major Russian banks and banning high-tech imports. The Prime Minister spoke today to the House of Commons.
Above all, the House will realize the hard and heavy truth that we now live in a continent where an expansionist power deploying one of the world's most formidable military machines, is trying to redraw the map of Europe in blood and conquer an independent state by force of arms. And it's vital for the safety of every nation that Putin's squalid venture should ultimately fail and be seen to fail. However long it takes, that will be the steadfast and unflinching goal of the United Kingdom. I hope of every member of this House and every one of our great allies, certain that together we have the power and the will to defend the cause of peace and justice as we have always done. And I say to the people of Russia, again, whose president has just authorized an onslaught against a fellow Slavic people, I cannot believe that this horror is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status that these actions will bring to the Putin regime. And to our Ukrainian friends, in this moment of agony, I say that we are with you and we are on your side. Your right to choose your own destiny is a right that the United Kingdom and our allies will always defend, and in that spirit, I join you in saying Slava Ukraini, and I commend this statement to the House.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to the House of Commons in London. Boris Johnson leads the Conservative Party. Another paragraph from the Guardian newspaper article about today's events, about the sanctions announced, reads that the Labour leader, the main opposition leader, Keir Starmer, said his party would support the measures, saying the public would face economic pain as a result, but the British public have always been willing to make sacrifices to defend democracy on our continent, and we will again. One of the members of Parliament asking Prime Minister Johnson a question was Theresa May, a former Prime Minister, and like Johnson, with the Conservative Party.
Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement this afternoon? This House and this country are united in our defence of democracy and our support for the Ukrainian people. Vladimir Putin has initiated war in mainland Europe. The response must be unequivocal and absolutely clear. So will my right honourable friend confirm that the government is putting in place every possible economic sanction so that Russia feels absolutely the cold wind of isolation and the Russian people understand that Vladimir Putin has brought their state to a pariah state?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and she's absolutely right about what the government is setting out to do, and I do indeed believe that that will be the result for Putin and his cronies.
As the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson getting a question from former Prime Minister Theresa May in the House of Commons. From Reuters, NATO has no troops inside Ukraine and has no plans to send any into the country. The alliance's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told a news conference on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Stoltenberg said, "What we have made clear is that we have already increased and we are increasing the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance on NATO territory." Ukraine, notes Reuters, is a partner of the Western Defense Alliance, but not a NATO member. Secretary General Stoltenberg speaking from NATO headquarters in Brussels.
Russia has attacked Ukraine. This is a brutal act of war. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine. Sadly, what we have warned against for months has come to pass. Despite all calls on Russia to change course and tireless efforts to seek a diplomatic solution, peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history. We have just finished a meeting of the North Atlantic Council to discuss the situation. The Council also addressed a request by Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia to hold urgent consultations under Article 4 of the Washington Treaty. This is a grave moment for the security of Europe.
The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg speaking in Brussels, Belgium, where the Defense Alliance is headquartered. NATO includes the United States, Canada, and 27 European countries. Stoltenberg making it clear NATO will respond to an attack by Russia on any of its members.
NATO's core task is to protect and defend all allies. There must be no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. This is our collective security guarantee. Today, the North Atlantic Council decided to activate our defense plans at the request of our top military commander, General Todd Walters. This is a prudent and defensive step to protect and shield allied nations during this crisis. And it will enable us to deploy capabilities and forces, including the NATO response force, to where they are needed.
The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. Associated Press has a couple of articles about a few NATO countries that have had some ties to Russia. They write that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has condemned Russia's attack on Ukraine and for the first time laid responsibility directly on Moscow for the tensions and violence in Hungary's eastern neighbor. A member of the European Union and NATO that borders Ukraine, Hungary under Orban has pursued close ties with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, a point of concern for many of Hungary's Western powers. That from AP. Another AP story reading, Turkish President Recep Erdogan says Russia's military action in Ukraine violate international laws and amount to a heavy blow to regional peace and stability. Erdogan said Turkey, which has enjoyed close ties to both Russia and Ukraine, sincerely regrets that the two countries are confronting each other. And a third story from AP has Czech President Miloš Zeman, who has been a leading pro-Russian voice among European Union leaders, has condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an unprovoked act of aggression. Russian President Putin's order to invade Ukraine came Wednesday night as the United Nations Security Council was holding an emergency meeting about Ukraine and the crisis there. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was pleading for peace, for Putin to pull back his troops. Today, Secretary General Guterres making a statement at UN headquarters in New York City.
We are seeing Russian military operations inside the sovereign territory of Ukraine on a scale that Europe has not seen in decades. Day after day, I've been clear that such unilateral measures conflict directly with the United Nations Charter. The Charter is clear, and I quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The use of force by one country against another is the repudiation of the principles that every country has committed to uphold. And this applies to the present military offensive. It is wrong, it is against the Charter, it is unacceptable, but it is not irreversible. I repeat my appeal from last night to President Putin. Stop the military operation. Bring the troops back to Russia. We know the toll of war. With death rising, we are seeing images of fear, anguish, and terror in every corner of Ukraine. People, everyday innocent people, always pay the highest price. That is why the United Nations is scaling up our humanitarian operations in and around Ukraine. Today, I'm announcing that we'll immediately allocate $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to meet urgent needs. We and our humanitarian partners are committed to staying and delivering to support people in Ukraine at their time of need. United Nations staff are working on both sides of the contact line, always guided by the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. We are providing life-saving humanitarian relief to people in need, regardless of who or where they are. The protection of civilians must be priority number one. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld. The decisions of the coming days will shape our world and directly affect the lives of millions upon millions of people. In line with the Charter, it's not too late to save this generation from the scourge of war. We need peace. Thank you.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the UN in New York City. New York Times reporting that U.S. Army troops are preparing to move closer to Poland's border with Ukraine to help process people fleeing the country after Russia launched an all-out assault. An Army spokesman said on Thursday, as Poland said it was ready to provide shelter to anyone fleeing the conflict. American officials estimating that a nationwide attack on Ukraine could result in 1 million to 5 million refugees, many of them going to Poland. And reports now coming out of Russia that over 1,700 people were arrested in anti-war protests that took place in dozens of cities across the country. That's according to a civil society group that's been banned in Russia, OVD Info. You can find all of C-SPAN's coverage of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, all the briefings at cspan.org, our video library. CPAC, the annual Conservative Political Action Conference, is getting underway in Orlando, Florida. Business Insider writing that Donald Trump is one of the biggest topics of conversation here at the Conservative Political Action Conference. His name covers the shoes, stickers, T-shirts, and hats of attendees. There's no question he's their star. But the former president wasn't part of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' big speech Thursday before the largest annual conservative gathering in the United States. Instead, DeSantis focused on DeSantis, earning rounds of applause while taking a victory lap over his own approach to the COVID-19 pandemic in Florida while frequently bashing the current president. Here's the Florida governor.
I got into politics about 10 years ago. I ran for Congress. I had never been involved. And my mission was largely to stop Barack Obama, who was president at the time. I even wrote a book, which was read by about a dozen people, that talked about some of the problems, how it was not consistent with the values that the country was founded on. And I stand by that. Those were good fights, important fights. But I got to tell you, I look back at that time, it almost seems a little quaint to me, because the threats we face to freedom, the threats we face to a just society are much more pervasive than they were just 10 years ago. I mean, think of what the left wants to do. What are their political aims? If they had just elected a couple more U.S. senators, they were going to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. They were going to make D.C. a state, so they'd have 2 radical left-wing Democrat senators for life. They were going to abolish the Electoral College so California could elect the president, and they wanted to federalize fraudulent ballot practices. Now, say what you want about that. That is not an agenda that very many American families are sitting across the dinner table from each other saying, oh man, I wish we could make D.C. a state, or I wish we could pack the Supreme Court. No, that's not what people have on their mind. They're concerned about gas prices, crime, the border, all the disorder around the world. That's what they're concerned about. They're doing that, though. The left wants to do that because their goal is not to make our country great. It's to marginalize the conservative half of the country. They want us to be powerless. They want us to be voiceless. They want us to be second-class citizen. And what are these ideological aims? The woke is the new religion of the left. And this is what they have in mind. That's why they want CRT, because they want to divide the country. That's why they remove statues of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. Take George Washington's name off schools, because they want to erase that history. They want to delegitimize our founding institutions, and they want to replace that with their left-wing ideology as the foundational principles of our modern-day society. Wokeism is a form of cultural Marxism. It is not just about raising taxes or bad economic policy. It's about tearing at the fabric of our society and trying to replace it with something that will be much, much more sinister. And the problem that we face as conservatives is a lot of major institutions in our country have become infected with this woke virus.
Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis at CPAC in Orlando, the Conservative Political Action Conference put on by the American Conservative Union. Politico reporting a new poll from Public Opinion Research Lab at the University of North Florida asking registered Republicans in Florida who they would support in a 2024 Republican presidential primary. DeSantis gets 44%, former President Donald Trump 41%. That's within the margin of error. Donald Trump, by the way, will be speaking at CPAC on Saturday, 7 p.m. Eastern. You can listen to that speech live on C-SPAN Radio. And thank you for listening to Washington Today. Get more top Washington stories sent to you each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word. Just go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. Have a good night.